Hey everyone! Today I want to talk about Nanook of the North from 1922 by Robert Flaherty. This is the 41st episode in my 1,000 favorite movie series, where I talk about the movies I love the most in a random order. When people ask me what my favorite genre is, my default answer is usually musicals, but my real answer would simply be good movies. I'm not really a fan of slapping genre labels onto movies, or separating movies in my head by these arbitrary categories. For one, many of the best movies confound genre expectations and or are fusions of several different genres. But furthermore, defining genres in the first place is much easier said than done. What's exactly the difference between drama and melodrama, horror versus thriller, or perhaps most interestingly, what is a documentary? F for Fake, which I've already talked about as part of the series, provocatively challenges the notion of what's considered a documentary, as it's difficult to tell with absolute certainty what's real and what's fake in it. I say all this because this movie, Nanook of the North, while not as radical as the Wells film, and despite it usually being acknowledged as the first feature length documentary, asks many questions of its own about the difference between documentary and fiction. While being a documentary on the surface, it's widely known that much of it was staged, with certain scenes in particular not being true to life at the time. But even if it's not a 100% pure documentary, I say, who cares? Not only did Flaherty make a fascinating historical record that has an undeniable feeling of authenticity, but he crafted a compelling and engaging story that makes it hold up over 100 years later. Part of what's so entertaining about it is simply the subject matter. It's about Inuit people going through a series of adventures, or it would be adventures for most people watching, but here's just daily life. A lot of it involves hunting, but we also get trading, building an igloo, children's play, traversing the snowy landscape, and more. We get to see these in great detail, with the camera lingering long enough for us to really absorb everything and take it all in. I especially like to focus on dogs and children and how they're taken care of. We even get to see at one point that the puppies are allowed inside the igloo for protection and are given their own mini igloo. We also see small children being carried in their mother's hoodie, and how when they sleep, they're pressed against her bare body to keep them warm. It's interesting details like these that really transport us to this new environment and situation we're not used to. That's part of the reason why I love movies, and this quality is especially there in documentaries. If the movie were just a straightforward documentary detailing this life, it would have been enough, especially for a 1922 audience, and even more especially for a 1916 audience, when production of the film was initially finished. However, after much of the film was accidentally destroyed, Flaherty decided this wasn't enough, and so he went back and evolved his idea even further, and this is where I'd imagine his cinematic genius was born. The documentary as a feature film form hadn't even been invented yet, and he already wanted to reinvent it. This materialized as a fusion with fiction, telling a story about a single family and its leader, Nanook. He became the main character in the film's story. Not a traditional narrative story, mind you, but the story about this time for these people. Some may question my interpretation of the movie having a fiction like story, and that's certainly a valid doubt. But when I watch the film, I personally get the sense of a sweeping story, especially in the second half of the film. There's an episodic feeling of a series of documentary like set pieces to it, but Flaherty's able to string them all together naturally, just as a fiction storyteller would. This is mostly accomplished through the beautiful intertitles that explain what their next actions will be. The sequences are relatively disconnected at first, as we get cards simply saying what happens next without much of an indication of how much time has passed. However, starting about a half an hour in, winter hits, and then we get one clear, continuous story about the family's journey for food. And this is where the movie really starts to feel like a narrative in a fiction film. But not only does it feel like fiction, it is fiction because this journey is an illusion. It's staged, and what isn't staged is edited to make it seem sequential, which I'd venture to say it wasn't. In fact, the various stagings make up what makes this movie controversial. The most fundamental lies are that Nanook wasn't his real name, and his wife wasn't really his wife, rather Flaherty's partner. He also changed parts of their lifestyle at the time, such as having them hunt with already outdated traditional weapons instead of the rifles they were used to, using a much bigger than usual igloo cut in half so that the camera could be placed inside with sufficient lighting, and wanting Nanook to act ignorant about what a gramophone was, even though he wasn't, for the sake of a comedy interlude. This last example is perhaps the only unforgivable staging that was done, making him look like a fool even though the real Nanook knew better. But apart from that, It's all in the spirit of what Flaherty wanted to do. He didn't want to just make a straightforward documentary about what life was like. Instead, he wanted to take real life and mold it into a story that celebrates Inuit life. He exaggerates their hardships, highlights their joys, and presents them as sort of mythic, elemental figures through their usage of traditional weaponry. To me, this integrating of fiction is what makes the movie still feel vital today. But don't get me wrong, the core of this movie is true. There are no special effects, no actors pretending to be Inuit when they're not, no guys in walrus costumes or anything. Apart from the spacious inside of the giant igloo, everything you see is real. The dogs, the elements, the work, the play, the hunting, the eating, the sleeping, it's all authentic and shows the power of real life. For example, probably the most captivating of all the documentary sequences shows the building of the igloo. Who hasn't been curious about how igloos are built? Well, this will answer all your questions. I love the huge walrus ivory knife he uses that easily cuts through and shaves all the different blocks they have to use. This even shows how they put in a window and get light to reflect through it. What also makes the sequence rich is that 30 cuts between this and the children playing in the snow while they're waiting. This is not only a wonderful real life detail, but it brilliantly condenses the igloo building to a reasonable time. There are also very raw scenes involving animals, namely the dogs. After they catch a seal through the ice, as the movie puts it, from the smell of flesh and blood comes the bloodlust of the wolf, and we see the dogs viciously bare their teeth in hunger, and after they eat, they attack each other. I don't know how many of these shots were shot from how many different locations and or times, as one camera couldn't possibly have captured everything in one sequence, but the naked rawness of the scene makes this not matter. I guess my main point in all of this is that even though we may not be able to completely believe that everything that happens on screen actually happened as is presented, this mixture of documentary and fiction is so seamless and effective that it becomes a great cinematic experience. And speaking of, let me get to my favorite moments. The first is part of the igloo building scene. When it's over, we get a title card that says complete within the hour, which is truly an amazing fact, considering it usually takes me about an hour to make a salad. And after this fact, Nanook emerges from inside the igloo and smiles and laughs directly into the camera, almost like he's showing off and laughing at the rest of us. I love the shot because it really captures his good spirit and makes him a figure of tremendous sympathy. Imagine a man from over 100 years ago doing that to us. This is also one of several examples of people looking right into the camera, giving this even more credibility as a documentary. The movie captures real people on the screen. There are many wonderful shots in the movie, but I think the coolest one is one where we see Nanook approaching the walruses. As he's sneaking up to them, the camera is being stealthy too, as we can tell that it's very low to the ground, trying to stay out of sight. I also love how the focus changes, starting with the walruses having the focus and Nanook's butt being a blur, but eventually they're both in focus. It's a shot that feels ahead of its time. And finally, there's the last 6 or 7 minutes of the film, so spoiler alert if you don't want to know. This is the most arresting scene in the movie for me, and it's when the family takes shelter in an igloo during heavy winds, so it's extremely cold. But radically, the focus shifts from them to focus on the dogs. They can't come inside, so they're stuck outside to put up with nature. It's interesting because they were very aggressive earlier, but now they've calmed down and can only stay put against the power of nature. The dogs give their lonely howl, which takes on a strange emotional value here, because in this scene alone, we're now putting ourselves in the dog's place. Flaherty cuts back and forth between them and their masters, contrasting the humans' relative comfort to the dogs just covered in snow. This is all done so beautifully, given incredible atmosphere by the blue filter used on the lens, reflecting nighttime and, as the intertitles put it, the melancholy spirit of the North. In its own way, I truly think this moment has us empathizing with animals at least as much as any other non animated film ever made. So, in the end, what I love about Nanook of the North is that it takes us to might as well be another planet for most of us and shows us its people, especially one of its people, and has us rooting for him. But even more than this one individual, it's a fascinating portrait of what life was like for this group of people. I can't imagine the thrill this must have given to audiences back during its original release. Today, we can see footage from just about anywhere in the world we want almost instantly, but of course during the 20s they couldn't. So, in that way, the movie exemplifies the power of film. But don't think that this is just one of those films that can simply be relegated to film history, only to talk about but not to watch. On the contrary, I think this still stands up as a very entertaining and gripping movie, and for that is one of my 1000 favorite movies. Thanks for watching my video. Goshoujo makoto ni arigatou gozaimasu. Have you seen The Nook of the North? Let me know what you think in the comments. I think of all my favorite movies as my friends, and I think my audience is friends too. Remember, I upload a new video every Friday, so if you want to help me complete this 1000 favorite movies epic, don't forget to like and subscribe.